Good morning, everybody. Thanks again for tuning into my YouTube channel. And today, you're not going to get to see my face today, which is probably a blessing in disguise. Today, it's going to be all screen sharing stuff. I have a bad case of hay fever, and I'm pretty exhausted from last week's conference and a couple of weddings this weekend. So we're going to go straight to the computer. And today, I'm going to talk to you entirely about my JPEG settings. I've had a lot of questions about this in terms of the different parameters and settings for all of the different JPEG types that I use in my Fujifilm cameras. So I thought it might be useful to create a little video where I essentially just show you every single one of the JPEG settings I have in my cameras. And this is true for all of my Fujifilm cameras, right the way from the kind of XE3 to GFX, X Pro 2, XT2. Some of them are going to have slight subtle changes because some of the older sensors don't have things like acros, but you'll pick that up as you go along. There should be ways of working around all of these independently as we get going. Now, one thing I have to say before we start is please do hit that bell icon if you are a subscriber or you want to subscribe, like and share, all of those good things. The recent YouTube changes in their algorithm has meant that unless you hit that little bell, you won't get notifications of new videos in the future. Okay, so with that in mind, let's get going, and I am going to show you all of my custom JPEG settings and give you some examples of how they look straight out of the camera. Many of you will probably already know that the Fujifilm cameras allow you to set up to 7 custom settings. Now those custom settings only affect JPEG. And you'll see here, I've got the 7 here that I use. I've got one titled Day. I have another one titled Meyerowitz, which is based on Joe Meyerowitz type images. I have one called Night, and I have another one which will come up now called Darcy Padilla, or Padilla I call it, in the camera. I have another one called Parr, which is based on Martin Parr type images. Another one called Portrait, and I think a final color one which I call Street. Now what I'm going to do is show you a preview of each of those images based on one picture, and I'll show you the subtle differences. I'll also show you the settings used, and I'll show you the way to set those up in your Fujifilm cameras. And I think, a very important thing to say here is there's no right or wrong. This isn't a RAW versus JPEG argument whatsoever. In fact, I mean, I shoot JPEG a lot, but I've actually been shooting more RAW recently than ever before. And I think that, what we have to remember with the Fujifilm cameras is that we have a great capacity to use these custom settings, and many people don't use them. It could well be that you're going to end up shooting RAW plus JPEG. It doesn't make any difference, but these JPEG files that we get out of the camera will, we used to have an advert in the UK, allow the train to take the strain. And I believe that fully with the cameras. So if the cameras can do most of the processing for us, or at least give us a very close starting point, then we're good to go. Okay, so the first one we'll go through is the one that I call Day. And remember, I'm going to show you how to set up the cameras, the custom settings, in a moment. But I think it's worth me explaining what I'm looking for in the definition of the image. And I'll also pop up the JPEG settings on the screen in front of you so you can take note of those. Now, ever since the Acros film simulation was applied to the cameras, I've been a huge lover of those, and my kind of go-to black and white setting is this, I guess, which is the day setting. I call it the day setting, and you'll see that it has the Acros plus R filter, which is quite gritty and adds quite a bit of contrast, but that's really what I like. In fact, there's only one film simulation that I've created, or in one custom setting that I've created, which uses monochrome rather than acros, and that's the Padilla one, which you'll see in a little bit, and I'll explain why. So you'll also see that I've used the highlights and shadows to create a subtle tone curve, what would be a normal tone curve if you were applying it in Lightroom. And I've set the noise reduction to -1 because actually this is what I'm going to be using during the day. So you'll see there's a night setting coming up, and during the day I don't really need the camera. I don't want the camera to be doing too much noise reduction on these JPEGs. In the old days, of course, in the days of the X100 and the X Pro 1, the noise reduction was really aggressive in the cameras, but that's been relaxed quite substantially actually, and it's pretty good in the camera now. You'll also see I set the sharpness to +1. So that's given it a little bit of a punch. Now, it may well be that later you need to, if you do adopt any of these settings, you'll adjust these to your own taste, I'm sure. And many of you will, even if you do shoot JPEG, will still want to kind of edit these images slightly. So you'll know if you've looked at any of my work that I add a warm tone, a little bit more contrast to pretty much all of my images. And I will do another video showing how I edit those JPEG images in both Lightroom and also in Alien Skin Exposure, because both of those tools are really good for this. And if we go into the next one in the list, we have the Meyerowitz one, which is based on, I've looked at a lot of images by Joel Meyerowitz, and this is kind of, it's not an exact science, but this is me trying to emulate, based on the very limited parameters I have within the camera, of course, the image style that I think at least comes out in Joel's work quite a lot, his color work, of course. Now, when I say this, I call it Meyerowitz in the camera, and it's very much a personal adaptation of what I think his images look like. It's just a starting point, I guess. But with that in mind, I actually shoot with this film simulation a lot, or this custom setting, I should say, a lot. This is kind of my go-to daytime color setting now. It's changed a little bit over time, but this is the one that I use. So I think the interesting thing about this custom setting that I've created is actually it's based on the ProNeg High film simulation, which, although this looks a little bit like classic Chrome, I've kind of adapted ProNeg High to get to what I want and to try and emulate as much as I think it possibly does some of Joel Meyerowitz's kind of color work. So it's ProNeg High. I've actually switched the grain on, okay, and I've set the grain to weak because I do want this to look like film. I want it to have a very filmic look, and the weak grain, high grain is too much for this. So weak grain works perfectly well. And again, I've used the highlights and shadows kind of S-curve to try and give a little bit of density to the images in the areas that I want. And remember, I'm going to say this several times through this is probably just a starting point, and you will adjust this to your own taste. Now, you'll also notice that I've dropped the color by -2. Of course, you won't see the color option available in the monochrome settings, but when you switch the color film simulations on, you will have an option to increase the strength of the color or decrease the strength of the color. So I found that using ProNeg High with color down to -2 is the closest thing that I'm getting to what I want with this particular look. And again, I've set the sharpness to +1 just to give it a little bit of punch, a little bit of bite. And in this case, I've set the noise reduction to -2. And the reason for that is because I still want the camera to create this filmic look. So I still want it to do some noise reduction, but I don't want it to be full. I don't want it to do a full set of noise reduction because I want it to still maintain some of that filmic look. Now, you'll be aware, those of you that have been in the Fujifilm world for a while, that in the previous X-Trans sensor cameras, we had the option to go down to -2 for noise reduction, and now we have the option to go down to -4. So -4 is not the same as off. There is still something applied within the camera. There is no kind of way of just saying do not apply any noise reduction whatsoever, as far as I can tell anyway. And so for this particular type of image, this particular look that I'm after, noise reduction -2 seems to work okay. Now remember, of course, if you're shooting this at very high ISOs, or your exposure is pushing your ISO very high, and you're going to see more grain, you're going to see more noise, and that may well be something you're after and you're happy with. But bear in mind that these are, like I say, starting settings, and it may well be sometimes if I'm shooting this, typically I'm not shooting this at night, I must admit, or in the dark. But if I do end up shooting with this kind of approach, at least, then the noise reduction is the one thing that I might be jotting around with. I might change that slightly, move it up to -3 to see what's happening with the grain during the evening time. Okay, so that was the Joel Meyerowitz on my attempt at emulating a Joel Meyerowitz type finish to an image, and we shall move on to the next one. So this is the next one is the one that I've creatively called Night. Guess when I tend to use this word. So this is one I'm shooting later on, or shooting at higher ISOs, or I kind of want to emulate that kind of stuff anyway. And actually it's not that different to the daytime one. There's some kind of subtle differences, but probably the most notable subtle difference is the different Acros variant that I'm using. So in the nighttime, I'm using the yellow filter on the Acros, and the reason for that is because the red is very contrasty. Now, if you're shooting at night or you're shooting in low light situations, I mean, night is is obviously a very subjective time, but if you're shooting in low light situations, the image density is probably going to be quite contrasty anyway because of the higher ISO and because of the exposure generally, depending on the time of the day, of course. So I find the yellow filter on the Acros film simulation is a little more yielding. It's a little less aggressive. It's more pleasing for the skin tones, especially, and it's not going to give you the, you're not going to get too much blocking in the shadows. You're not going to get too much detail loss there. The rest are pretty similar. You'll notice that it says grain off. Now, I would never recommend that you have grain switched on an Acros film simulation image. The reason for that is because the Acros film simulation itself has grain built into it. So the sensor itself will be adding grain into that image to try and emulate that film, to emulate that Acros film itself. So I say I recommend you don't have a grain turned on for the Acros film simulation. It is, of course, entirely up to you, entirely. But for me personally, I find that if I apply grain to Acros, it's too much. It's just too much. Now you'll see the other subtle difference is the highlight shadow is very similar. I'm just kind of changing that shadow slightly, just making it a little bit darker there. And the highlights, I'm leaving them actually, because remember that typically this custom setting I'll be using later at night in darker areas, and so I want to recover that highlight area as much as possible if possible. I need to protect it where I can. Sharpness, again, I've set that to 0. I don't really want it to be adding too much more contrast, because that will probably be happening naturally through the ISO and through the kind of elevated exposure. Noise reduction I've set again at that mid -2 level, because I do bear in mind that this typically will be being used at higher ISOs. I do need the camera to be doing some noise reduction. I would prefer to be doing a noise reduction in camera than worrying about it later in Lightroom or Alien Skin, for example. The camera will do a far better job of it. Now, of course, remember this is JPEG stuff. So if you're shooting RAW as well as JPEG, then none of these settings will apply to your RAW files at all. You will have a basic level RAW file, which you can do noise reduction, sharpness, shadows, all of that kind of stuff to your heart's content later in post-production. Now, this next one is probably my favorite one. I've called it Padilla after Darcy Padilla, and if you've checked out my YouTube channel, you'll see I did a review of her book very recently, and her images are just beautiful. Now, what you will see if you check out her work, of course, is that her black and whites are, mostly, she's shooting film, of course, but mostly they're, these images are from kind of the 70s, 80s, 90s. And so I'm trying really with this custom setting to really push it so it looks very much like a film-based stock that is going to be gritty, it's going to be grainy, it's going to be I don't know what's the right word. It's gonna add depth to the image. It's really going to give it a feeling, and this is definitely, currently at least, my favorite black and white setting to be using, black and white configuration, I should say. Now, if you look at the settings there, you'll notice that I'm using the monochrome film simulation rather than Acros. Now, Acros itself actually produces a very pleasing filmic look, of course, but in this case, for me to try and get this kind of structure to the image, I'm choosing monochrome because I want to use the camera's strong setting for grain. So I'm adding grain to the monochrome plus R filter, and I think that gives me the density that I want. I can't quite get this from the Acros. Acros is great, like I said many times, but it's, for this particular approach, this kind of Darcy Padilla type emulation that I'm trying to achieve, then I'm going to use the monochrome plus red filter with grain set to strong. I'm setting the highlights to 0 because I want those protected also, but the shadows, you'll see I've gone quite aggressive with this and I've hit it to +3, and that's because I really want to punch that out. I really want to kind of, this works really well, I've found, if you're spot metering and you're metering for the highlights and you want to really see a real separation between the highlight areas and the dark areas. I've set the sharpness to +1 because I want to give it a little bit of punch, but noise reduction I've set to 0 because, again, I don't want to apply noise reduction to an image that I'm trying to really look very filmic. If I'm shooting this at late or very kind of high ISOs, then I'll probably use my night film simulation. This I want to set to, kind of going to be using this probably during better lighting situations when I'm controlling the exposure, using spot metering probably, and so noise reduction at 0 is perfect for me in this case. And like I said, this is probably my favorite one right now for black and whites. I love it. And actually, when you edit these images and if you warm them up very slightly, or you just add a tiny bit more contrast in post-production, you get a really beautiful black and white image, I find. Okay, let's move on to the next one, which I think is number 5. And it's another color one, and now this is the one that I've titled Parr, kind of trying to emulate the very colorful, the very vibrant images of Martin Parr. Now, of course, you know, Martin Parr, love him or hate him, I love him, I love his work, all of it. He's mostly kind of known for his very kind of very high contrast, very colorful images. But actually, if you look back through his archive, especially stuff like the Hebden Bridge work, there's some beautiful, beautiful monochrome work. He's a very, very good photographer. And, you know, not only in the kind of way that he approaches his photography, but in the subjects and the stories that he tells. But this is all about trying to get a much more high contrast color image that has a little bit more pop, I suppose. And this isn't something that I would necessarily use all of the time. Probably won't use it much at weddings. I do use it quite a bit for street photography stuff when the light is really good, and you know, on those very rare British summer days when we have blue skies and you know people are wearing colorful clothes, etc., then I think this film simulation or this kind of custom simulation works really well in those environments. Okay, so let's see how we build this. So this is the film simulation Velvia. The Velvia film simulation is very vibrant in its own right. Grain is switched off. I have the highlights set to -1 and shadow set to +2. Again, just giving it a very subtle S-curve. Color is set to +2 because I really want this, you know, I'm choosing Parr in my custom settings because I want this to be a very vibrant, colorful image. It's not going to be used that often, but you know, I want to really emphasize that color. So getting the camera to build on that and make that color even stronger, even more vibrant. Sharpness +2 to again give it a little bit more density, and node reduction just -1, and that's really just a kind of comfort level, if you like, in terms of if I'm wandering into higher ISO levels with this, which is probably quite rare, then you know I'll have a little bit of noise reduction applied within the camera. So that's the Martin Parr type film simulation, which you know, like I said, it's not going to be to everybody's taste, but I think it's quite a nice one to have in the custom settings because, you know, if you do find yourself, I don't know, maybe you're at the seaside or you're out with the kids or, you know, anywhere where I think that there's a, you know, color is a feature of the environment you're in and you're photographing that color or you want that color to be evident in the images, then I think this is something that this particular custom setting might just work for you. Okay, let's move on to the next one. And the next one is the portrait setting, and the portrait setting is essentially just a little bit softer. It's less aggressive. It's not really looking so much for contrasty blacks. It's kind of no grain or anything like that in this image. Now, what I'm using here is the Acros plus green filter, which I think is pleasing. This obviously isn't really a portrait image you're seeing in front of you, but I would typically use this if I'm taking pictures of the kids or I'm doing any kind of portraiture at a wedding, or if I'm doing anything close-up work, or you know, something where the skin tones, you want to kind of make those a little bit more pleasing. So this is using the Acros plus green filter. Obviously the grain is off. I have the highlight set to -1 and the shadow set to +2, just like one of the other ones. And sharpness is at 0 and noise reduction at -1. Again, sharpness at 0 because this is meant to be, this isn't meant to have that kind of punch to it. This isn't meant to be given that kind of detail. And the noise reduction again -1, just to kind of complement any kind of noise that's in that image and just touch it down slightly. Like I said, this is probably the film simulation, or sorry, the custom setting based on a film simulation that I use the least, but it's nice to have it in the arsenal. It is nice to have it in the camera ready to just switch on in case you are doing any kind of close-up work, or you're taking a snap of people that, you know, portrait, a selfie, whatever, I don't know, that you don't want really to have that aggressive contrast that may be evident in some of the other film simulations. Okay, so on to the last one, which is the one that I have called Street, which, as you will probably guess, is the one that I will typically use for kind of color work. It's probably not something I'm going to use too much at weddings, although, you know, I mean, like I say, I keep saying, I mean, these are just names I'm giving them. These are, you can do this yourself, and it may be that you use one more than the other. They're pretty interchangeable, but, you know, I try and title them, so in my tiny little Welsh brain, I can just look at the words and think, actually, yeah, I'm on the street, I'm going to use this one, or I want to emulate Martin Parr, I'm going to do this one. I really want some gritty black and whites, I'm going to go for Darcy Padilla. So yeah, of course, it's very subjective, but this is the one that I have creatively titled Street. And this is the only one that I'm basing on the classic chrome film simulation. Now, if you're using any of the older cameras that do not have classic chrome in them, then you can probably, this is very close to kind of the Martin Parr type emulation, so you can probably use Velvia and just dial it back a little bit. So classic chrome, grain off, highlights -1, shadows +2 as per some of the other ones. Color, I've set this to -1 because, you know, I like classic chrome, but you know, I've found that I want to just dial it back slightly, that color. I like the mutedness, I like the classic chrome, just tiny bit too strong for me, I think, in many cases. So the strength of the color I'm just dialing back, and I'm setting the sharpness to +1 as per the others, just to give it that little bit of punch in the camera. And again, noise reduction to 0, and that's probably in my mind I'm thinking I'm not probably going to be using this too much during the evenings or anything like that, so I'm more than happy with the exposure that the camera is going to give me, or the noise that's built into that film simulation. So yep, that's the Street one, and I think that's all 7 of them. So what I'll do now is I'll just bring up the survey view and we'll go through them very briefly so you can see them all side by side. So press N on the keyboard to get survey mode up, and then just select all of the images that you want in the survey mode, and you'll see some of them are very subtle. You've got the color ones there. You know, I find the Martin Parr one stands out quite a lot in the color world, because obviously it's the Velvia one, and in terms of the black and whites, if you see, I'm just moving them around to try and put the color ones together at the top, you'll see that the Darcy Padilla one has that punch, that real kind of very I don't know, filmic look to it, which is really what I like about those images, and it has that grain and it's very beautiful. Okay, so I'm going to show you now how to set up the custom settings in your camera and to title them and name them and all of that good stuff. So we will bring up the camera. I'm actually using an XE3 in this film, so the menus will be pretty much identical on your X Pro 2, X-T2, X100S, X100T, all of those things that allow you, any of the cameras that allow you to record custom settings will be pretty much the same. Okay, so you would go to your image quality settings and choose select custom setting. You can see I have them in here. I've called them Mullins, day, night, portrait, color, Parr, Padilla, Meyerowitz, all of that kind of stuff. I have them in here, and it tells you, it gives you a brief indication with the film simulation that you're using. Now, if you go into edit or save any of those, you can move down and all of the settings that I've given to you, and I will actually create a blog post on f16.click with these settings also. Might be a day or so after this YouTube video goes live, but check out the link below the video and I will put the link to the post in there. So you'll see, I mean, I'm not going to go through all of the settings again because I've just been through them, but you can see that you can actually go in here, you can choose to edit the custom name and save them accordingly. Now, you're going to make your own ones and call them whatever you wish. You'll see the only thing really that I haven't been able to explain with the images is the ISO setting. So the ISO will, in your custom settings, you can set your ISO to be fixed, or you can set it to an auto ISO variable. Now, for the night film simulation, or the custom setting, I should say, I actually set my auto ISO to push it up higher. So I'm kind of starting at 800. And another way to do that is to set your dynamic range to force it to 400%, and that will force your ISO up. So if you are looking for a little bit more kind of gritty, grainy type images, and you want to do that via ISO or via exposure, I should say, then you can hit that dynamic range there at 400, and then that's going to, you see, I've got it on the Darcy Padilla one. I'm setting that dynamic range to 400, which is going to force it to even be a little bit more gritty, a little bit more grainy, and this the grain effect there, set that to strong, as we mentioned in the images earlier. So putting the custom settings in your camera is very simple, it's very straightforward. You can edit the custom name, as I said, and if we look there at the Joel Meyerowitz one, you'll see that I have the Pro Neg High, have it set to the grain effect weak, and everything else as we discussed in the film earlier. So the white balance is the only thing we haven't really talked about, and I do pretty much set that to auto. The only time I manually set a white balance is if I'm shooting a disco or something at night and I need to kind of configure the white balance according to the disco lights. Okay, so let's go back to the computer and just do a couple of little compares so you can see some of the differences. So I'm just going to switch that to side-by-side view, and I will bring up, I'm just going to select none first and bring up the ones I want. So we have Night there and Padilla next to each other, and you'll see, you may be able to see it on the screen, but the Padilla is obviously much more grainy, it's much more deep. If I zoom right in, you'll see the grain there in the shirt. The shadows are really blocked out there in the Padilla one, but the Night one kind of works better. Obviously this is an ISO 320 image, so it's not an image that's necessarily going to be shooting late at night at that ISO. Let's go across to this one with the car, the bride moving away. So we have Padilla next to Parr. Street and Parr, very similar, but the street one is just weaker. You see Parr, it really pops. It's got that very vibrant color to it, I think. And then we'll just bring up the Meyerowitz one as well and compare that to Parr. And again, it's there's a visual difference there. Each one has their own pros and cons, of course. Now, what do we have in this box here? Image 4. Okay, so this is a close-up image of a bride being hugged, of course. We have the day, we have Meyerowitz. That looks quite nice, actually, the Meyerowitz in that particular light. Night, it's black and white, obviously quite neutral. But the Padilla one for black and white really gives it a little bit of bite. But there, you see Parr in that blue sky, boom. And then the portrait one, which actually makes the skin tones better, and then street finally there for that also. Then the final box here, we have a little bit more of a cluttered scene. So the day one works quite well. Meyerowitz, that's very nice, I think, for the color. Night, again, kind of, it's okay, but I'm really drawn to that Padilla every single time, for the black and white work at least. And then we have Parr. Again, you saw that very quickly. Sorry, I moved through it very quickly. And we're onto the street one there. So, I'll bring them into survey view. You'll see them. That Parr one really pops. The Padilla one really pops. There's an option there for everybody, I think, or certainly for me at least. Okay, so like I said, these are my film simulations, these are my custom settings, these are my names. You are absolutely more than welcome to use them yourself, use them as a starting point, totally ignore them, whatever. Maybe you just didn't know that you could create custom film simulations or custom settings in your camera. You can create up to 7, you can go with it. Now remember, it doesn't affect your RAW files, so if you're shooting RAW, this will have no impact whatsoever. If you're shooting RAW plus JPEG, then you will obviously have your RAW file plus the JPEG. But also remember, I find it really useful, even if I am shooting RAW, I will still shoot. Often I'll shoot in black and white when I'm shooting RAW, because I can see more, I can see the light more, I can see the dynamic range in the image better personally when I'm shooting in black and white. So think about that. If you do want to create these custom settings, but you still, you're a little bit conscious, you think I just want to use RAW at the end of the day, then you can still do this. You can still shoot with these, and they will at least give you the vision, or at least the kind of mindset, understanding the light fall off it, that where the dynamic of the scene in front of you, as you want to edit it later in RAW. So there you go. I hope you found it useful. A little bit waffling at the end, of course, as always. Wouldn't be one of my videos without a little bit of waffling. Please remember to like, to share, and hit that bell icon for the subscription stuff. And oh, by the way, if you're wondering about the XT100, how I got on with it last week, great. I really like that camera. It's still very weird for me to use it as a stills camera. I have been shooting with it. I went down to Brighton with Patrick LaRocque and with Facundo Santana and Neil James, and we had a day down there, and I used it quite a bit down there. Got some nice stills out of it, but mostly from a vlogging point of view, it's working really well. So my time with that camera is coming up. I have to send it back pretty soon, but I will do another video based on the vlogs that I have made. But I have to be totally honest with you, I am really uncomfortable walking down the street with a camera on a stick in front of me, but I'm getting there. I'm kind of trying to get over that battle. So hopefully, maybe, perhaps, the next video will be about the XT100. However, in the meantime, thank you very much for watching, and I shall see you next time.